David joins us, we'll be able to get started. Does that suit you?
I'm going to
Unless you really want us to speak. No.
I'll just make one small adjustment with the board back. We can start.
Okay. Right, Sonia, and we're just expecting. I don't know what's her name. Do you need help, Karen? No. And you have some flat pens too. All right. So let's get started. Just to get to know each other before we get started. Your first name and where you come from.
I'm Kim, and I'm from New York.
Mia, also from New York.
I'm Catherine from Schenectady, New York.
I'm Marion from New York. I'm yes, you. I'm Noémie and I'm from Normandy in France.
I'm Abeline and I'm from Perpignan.
I'm Sonia and I'm also from here.
David, and I'm from Syracuse, New York.
Joachim, and I'm from Bordeaux in the southwest of France.
I'm Lucy and I'm from Montreal in Canada.
I'm Diksha, I'm from New Delhi.
I'm Stephanie and I live in France.
And I'm Karen, and I live in Canada.
And I'm Pascale, and I'm from, let's say Normandy in the northwest of France. All right, so this is a poetry, poetic event, and we didn't want it to be too formal. So this is the reason why we're sitting in a circle. So my job is to introduce two amazing persons, Karen and David. So I'll stick to the program and give you a few words of introductions. Introduction about David, who comes, as he said, from Utica. He works at the University of New York, Moyne College in New York. He also directs the Center, the Creative Writing Program at the Moyne University. Living of the Water, which has just been published. 3 poetry collections. The Everyday Apocalypse, published in 2002. The Gospel According to Frank, spoilers, Frank is Frank Sinatra. And recently, a collection entitled Warriors. Frank's work relates to environmental and political concerns. He's going to read and comment on published and not yet published poems, dealing with, his focus is on intersections in the plural, between intersections of the human and non-human in suburban and urban environments, also in the plural. If you want to join us, you have some free chairs here, free seats.
Thank you so much.
Okay. And attempting not to adopt an anthropomorphic approach, and also exploring the limits of human language to or for expressing non-human life. I would not like to interrupt the reading and comment. Well, I'm not going to tell you all the philosophers she's intimate with, because she can tell you herself about them. And she's the author of three collections of poems, ballads, published in 2000, in which she tried to get the feel of time, 2005, and an amazing collection, which is going to tell you about, entitled The Grand River Watershed, published a few weeks ago. And this Grand River Watershed is a daring and fascinating adventure in poetry, history, science, sensibility, and ecology. So it's up to you, and we said maybe 20 minutes each to leave space for discussion, but then we'll see what happens. If you want to echo each other. Yeah.
Okay.
I'm sorry.
I think I'll stand so I can project a little better.
Please do.
And I'm going
And
to...
same with the audience if you want to stand and move and so on.
Let's see, I'm going to skip some of this, and I'm concentrating on independent life forms that are comfortable in and increasingly adapting to environments radically shaped by human activity. And I'm going to begin with a poem about enchantment. So some of these poems, only one I think is actually in a book I've published. So it's all new work and untested, so you're my experiment here. This is a poem about enchantment, and of course the conference topic is re-enchanting urban wildness. And the poem draws on the belief that the natural world was indeed enchanted for humans, and there was evidence of it everywhere humans looked around us. And that this enchantment was created and governed by gods and goddesses. So few humans believe in that now, of course, but this poem tries to imagine some earlier human ways of relating to our world while including contemporary references. It's titled Forgotten. The gods are angry. I hear it in their pulsing silence. Angry at the mirrors in bathrooms, at rivers no longer obeying the simplest dictates, at seas coagulating their own continents, at the multitudinous creatures sacrificed, but not to them, angry at wine leaked in alleyways, licked from sidewalks, angry at screaming birds that won't bend their wings, angry at thousands of buried suns. I should do something to save us, but I've forgotten which herbs to burn, forgotten who to love and why, which well is sacred for which disease, how to slash with a sanctified knife to give pulse, forgotten how to touch my firstborn, forgotten the words the gods can hear, forgotten even their names, always near our lips, and the names of their offspring, embalmed in constellations no longer out of reach. Some of these poems, of course, mourn what we've lost, and this is one of them that is a mourning poem. Some of them, I hope the next three, are more in the celebratory mode, which is equally important for what we have. And the next three poems are about birds, which of course are creatures that easily cross these boundaries we've been talking about, from wild to human curated spaces. And pigeons, crows, starlings, hawks who live in skyscrapers in New York City. I'll read three short poems. The first is titled Sovereign. And when I was sitting outside my house one day in the summer, I heard a very loud, aggressive little bird, tiny little bird, peek at my roof, a house wren. I knew what it was, but I didn't know anything about it. And my process is, which you'll see Karen's process later, but I watch, I get a notebook, I write down what I hear and see, if I want to write about it. Then I do research and try to find out as much as I can. This bird is a male bird making its noise to attract females. It had built several nests because the female needs to like one of the nests. None of that enters the poem, but I feel I have some confidence and maybe some context the more I know. The poem uses images drawn from human life, which I kind of have to do to try to get at something in this bird. The house wren, it's titled Sovereign. The house wren is at home wherever he is and won't shut up from the peak of my roof, foremost lectern in the land, above my home, as I call it, and can prove to you with documents the mouse scat on the counter and a yellow jacket buzzing death throes on the sill say otherwise. That this guy, fit as a fist, is sovereign over the sky, the air, the song from his throat, the shingles that slope away on either side. The goldfinch, if you don't know this bird, I'm not sure if it's in Europe or not, but in the North America, it's a beautiful golden-bellied bird, and it feasts on seeds of the thistle, which I hate because it grows everywhere. I kind of love it. I've grown to love it, I should say. I used to dig them out. It has needles and sort of thorns on it. Oh no. Thistle seed is what the goldfinch loves, and it's also nectar-producing plant, so it's a very good plant. So the Latin name for the goldfinch is Carduesis, forgive my Latin, tristis, sad thistle eater. It's the future goldfinch on the future thistle, and I think the poem is trying to welcome difference and let go of our resistance. Because the flowers have gone to seed, a goldfinch grasps a thistle stem to feast, impervious to slings and arrows, one's meat, another's poison. But I've stowed the shovel, taken off my gloves, shrugged a welcome to whatever rises above the meadow grass. Let the goldfinch guzzle seeds into his golden belly, shaking others free. Let wind lift those downy shoots heavenward. Let gravity beckon with grasping fingers, humming the good life down below. Let air suspend them until earth births them, suckles them, releases them, that future thistles might surge through the grass, flaunt their slings and outrageous arrows, that future goldfinches, sad only in their gentle mortality, might grip the stems of August thistles and feast on the strange and marvelous goodness that eludes me. Hawk in the city. The hawk sees with interior eyes the mouse on the stove, the cow in the stew, rats chewing, kittens, kids, puppies, measured and weighed, ponds, rivers, the ocean like a nearby star. Breathing is his business too, taking in the quick and the still, reddened sidewalks, sewer tenements, the cop's pistol holstered, the beggar's lung bursting, the reach of money through a wall, whiff of love through skin, hate that keeps the ears hammering with nothing to hit, the greed that runs fingers over surfaces. There's always enough for the hawk, but there's no rush. The sky redraws itself, the sun ascends between skyscrapers, through burnt air, through sealed windows, the moon ebbs and flows. Myself and many humans I know believe, or can be duped into believing, that what we make doesn't change. And I'm always kind of struck when I take walks, long walks where I live, how everything is constantly changing, that is the fact of the world we live in. So this is Everything Moves on that subject. The last time I checked, everything was different. Cicadas, not silence. And then a bird like a branch, on a branch, stark against pink, burning red, losing itself in dark blue, become ragged, not an edge, but a stage, because everything moves toward an end that recedes as far as I can see, not far, into sky that frames a cloud shaped like a dream years ago in another body, when I saw everything that could be seen until this moment, when dusk eludes the eye and time is always up. 2. Even rocks, even the mountain tombstone on the nuclear casket, even convictions, even the pinpoint of almost nothing in the vacuum nothing that became the universe, even the end of a moment, even births we remember each year with trembling flames. And don't forget the words we carved with chisels and muscle, eroding from wind, rain, sand, and the tracings of fingers along grooves and ridges. Even those have moved on. A short poem returning to birds, check this, and the theme of nature in flux. It tries to merge this idea of change with human resistance to change, tied up, I guess, with our resistance to dying, to mortality. My daughter makes a brief appearance in this poem, and it features creatures, besides her, where I live, red-winged blackbirds, cedar waxwings, come down from Canada, mosquitoes, peepers, which are little frogs, make a lot of noise, and one of the most beloved North American mammals, the beaver. It's titled Why. Why all these red-winged blackbirds where cedar waxwings once gathered, sweeping up mosquitoes over the pond? My daughter watched the waxwings at twilight from my shoulders as peepers kept up their invisible racket. Not that I mind a change of scene, but why do children grow up and remember what they please? Why do leaves trade their solid green for red, yellow, orange patches, then release themselves from what they love? Why must the old beaver move on, and that young one, arrived from God knows where, set up shop in the lodge with a big tail slap under those blackbirds sprinting branch to branch? You can't miss them, can you? Flaunting the red on their wings. And maybe, actually, I'll end with this poem, so there's time for poetry, maybe for some questions at the end. I hope. This is Sestina. I wanted to read it in Perpignan, I guess for obvious reasons. It's a connection with Provence, French poetry, and it returns to birds. And my bit of context is that I got up extremely early one morning, which I don't normally do, and heard this eruption of bird song, and the sky like an apocalypse, like the end of the world, fire. And I was thinking about memory and cycles, dawn and dusk, and consciousness, the consciousness of past and present, big ideas. I wanted to write a poem. And the Sestina, as you may know, is a very repetitive and circular form. 6 stanzas of 6 lines each, very symmetrical, with a 3-line coda at the end. And the final word of every line in the first stanza must be repeated in a particular line of every single stanza, and then all 6 words at the end. So it can be extremely boring because you keep hearing these words. Or, if you're lucky, maybe it can work. And it's great for writing about repetition, and I thought the form, Pascale was saying, how do you get beyond language merely to express something in the world? Form is one way, trying to stretch your form to suggest or gesture to something that's maybe inexpressible. So it's the everyday apocalypse, and thinking that these birds, I don't know if they, every morning this is the end of the world, next day this is the end of the world. So it's the everyday apocalypse. Invisible among the branches at dawn in my backyard, the birds begin to sing because, as birds, they believe this sun rises into the darkness of the last day. That this blue will never be blue again. That branches will never bend this same way. They can't know it's forever been this way. The world turning, the moon falling, then dawn when one has all but given up. Again and again they disregard the facts. They sing because they can't remember yesterday or imagine tomorrow. The sun's slow eruption into the night is the sun's most perfect performance. It goes on its way thereafter, leaving them just one day to squawk about, one chance to take, one dawn to make them open their eyes and sing about something, anything. What do they gain, we ask, by forgetting? What do we gain by remembering that perfect sunrise by Cape Cod or Bar Harbor? How singular that strip of burning cloud way off in the distance. Those memories of dawn, the brains of birds can't hold from one day to the next, maybe. But just for one day, I'd like to shrink down my overstuffed brain, sit myself in the quiet before dawn and see what I won't know is the sun announcing itself by degrees the way I couldn't know it always has. I'll sing then without pausing to hear what I'm singing. My tiny brain will take in the day, knowing without knowing that the only way to be is to forget the word again, the word before, even the word sun, and believe there is only one dawn, one moment to sing. If we begin again, it might be a day without trees, clouds, sun. It might be a long way to reach the dawn. I think I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
We're going to make sure that we understand this word, because it's one of those that could be easily misread by this, if you think you know what a shed is. So a watershed, pour ceux qui parlent français, a watershed is a geographical unit that would define an area of space based on the reach that pulls all the water into a river. Okay? So before there were trains and before there were cars, I speak from North American context, when people moved by rivers and lakes, the territories that they occupied, and in fact, the territories that different tribes of even the same nations occupy, are often indicated by watersheds. So I happen to live, I'm going to give you a little map. This is my map of North America and Mexico, Florida, a little bit over here, random Arctic, then you'll know this is Quebec. This is how we know this shape of right? And then this is that. Oh, this is good enough. There are giant lakes not far from where you live. So these guys live about here, and I live here. And these are the Great Lakes, and they're called the Great Lakes for a reason, is when people visit them, they can't believe it's called a lake. They're like, the impression of being near the Caspian Sea. So I live in this area. Okay, I live in the province of Ontario. This is a very local book. This book is a book of poetry that tries to enact, using as many kinds of epistemologies or ways of knowing and truth idioms as possible of what it feels like to occupy or inhabit a particular location, when one is trying to be as cognizant as possible of its varied and flowing and open human histories, and also its varied and flowing and open material histories, its meteorology, its bugs, its geological processes. So inside this place where I live, this is Ontario. So, Ontario. I live here. Here's Toronto. Here's Lake Ontario. Here's Niagara Falls. Here's Lake Erie. The Grand River is a very massive area that pulls all the waters from all these little ruisseaux, tiny, and pulls them all down into this basin that's called the Grand. And the Grand River dumps in Lake Erie. Lake Erie dumps in Niagara Falls. Niagara Falls goes to Lake Ontario. It goes out to the St. Laurent, and then it's in the Atlantic. So this is the watershed that I live in. And I'm going to draw a little box there that will become relevant in a minute. So this watershed, and the river is called the Grand River. It's not just a sense that it's a river that's grand. It's actually called the Grand River. And this particular river has a very, very contested political history. This area is subject to what's called Treaty 3, or the Between the Lakes Treaty, which was signed between the British Crown and the Mississaugas of the Credit, First Nations, and it's never really been fully respected. And I'll say one other thing that I think is important is there was a war between the United States, which was founded in 1776, and what wasn't yet Canada, which was still a British area, the British Empire. And so the US border runs basically right through here. There's Buffalo and there's Schenectady and stuff. So now we have US and Canada. that's divided in the middle of the Niagara River. It's very interesting to think about borders that are in the middle of rivers. But in the year 1812, the US invaded Canada, tried to invade Canada. And many, many factors involved. So this wasn't Canada, this was the British Empire, this was the British Crown. This was, you know, the Queen and King of England. Canada resisted the invasion of the US, and had it not been the case, then we would still, the border would probably be different, and where I live would probably be part of the USA. And one of the factors that I know to be an important factor in the resistance of the invasion of Canada was that many, many Native Americans joined the forces on the part of the British to resist. So we have major sort of military history that involves these Indian Mohawk battlers. So because the British resisted the invasion of the US, after the war, as a way of giving thanks to the Native peoples, and at that time it was the Mohawk, the Onondaga, the Oneida, the Seneca, to the north a little bit, the Neutral, the Potawatomi, as a way of giving thanks to these peoples. The Governor General of Canada said that on 6 miles on either side of the Grand River, from its beginning to its end, which is 900 miles, belongs to the natives. So almost all of inhabitation in southwestern Ontario lives inside this tract, which is called the Haldimand Tract. So we all live on land that was in fact given to the natives as part of defending our space. So it's a very contested space to live in if one knows that piece of Canadian history. So that's the watershed. Sorry, I'm getting it. I'm nervous and I'm excited. So there's, from the perspective of waves of human history, from this perspective I just told you, being a white person or a European person in this brings up the story of colonization and oppression. But from another story, it's also a big agricultural centers where we get a lot of our big, amazing, beautiful farms that supply food to our areas. And my grandparents on my mother's side were Scottish immigrants, and they settled farms. And there's also this discourse about pioneers, about the goodness of new immigrants, how important immigrants were for opening up the land. So human history itself has this complicated story that's sort of neither good nor bad. On the plus side, we have pioneers. On the negative side, we have colonizers. And then if you look also from the side of ecology, I'm very interested in what could be said ecologically about the space. What we also notice is a discourse of concern for preservation of native species, for preservation of native bees, native plants, native trees, and the worry about all these native types being decimated by the invasion of foreign pathogens. So if you put those two human histories and ecological genetic histories next to each other, you see that they contradict one another. They're both telling the story about the beauty of settlement, the importance of new species, the importance of things being able to adapt and survive, and on the other hand, how horrible it is because it knocks out other things that had a right to be there or were there first. So this book is a way of trying to write all of those together without resolving any of them, without resolving them into a story about which one is right. And the last thing I'm going to say before I launch is, in 2011, I was the writer in residence at this little box right here, which is a house beside the Grand River. And it was on a research area where scientists go to do their field work. There's 900 acres, and this little beautiful architectural space that I lived in, where I went to ostensibly write poetry. And so I was actually on the river and had to think about how to write poems about that space, which is, as David said, it's difficult to do. It's difficult to have a process. So what I did, just in a nutshell, was I tried to read everything and anything I could that was related to work that had come out of that space, and ecological, historical, archaeological, tourist, high culture, low culture, music that had been produced there, and tried to combine them into a whole that had a sensibility of an ecology itself. You know, it had some parts that came back again and again. It had some parasitic phrases. It has some dissonances inside, and the themes that I tried to actually show both in the form and in the content have to do with some themes that emerged, which have to do with, on the one hand, our obsession with saving things. And on the other hand, and our strategies with trying to save things ecologically, theologically, spiritually. And on the other hand, the importance of knowing that everything's flowing and can't be saved. Or maybe it can be saved and not saved. Okay, so I will read you. So I'll start with the first poem. The first poem is called Woodland Occupation of North Dumfries Township. So what we have is my words and then words that are stolen from various sources as found poetry. Without citation, because I think the history of North America is a history of theft. So yes. Among the Chippewa, young hickory, basswood, or elm, some sought ironwood because it bends easily when green, or tamarack. And the Hurons preferred cedar bark for roofing, harvested in spring when the sap was running, and the flats from elm and yellow birch, chestnut, oak, pine, black ash, or hemlock, peeled off the living trees. Among the Potawatomi, elm bark, or slippery elm. Among the Algonquin, the bark of walnut trees, which is wondrous tough, lashed together with pliable strips of fresh white oak or inner green basswood made into strong cordage. The Iroquois preferred the elm to chestnut, the hemlock to basswood, or ash for sheathing of their longhouses. Among the Winnebago, walls were of plaited cedar bark or black ash bark, or birch was sometimes used, about a yard square sewn together with spruce root. And all were made airtight, watertight, with spruce gum caulking. These are the specificities of culture, human culture and biological culture and choices. And one of the things you learn through these books is that many of these tree species have been decimated. So I'll read you, and they've been decimated, I'll read the first one, which is called Ash. So as a poet, one gets the license of being able to hit many registers at the same time. And as the poem progresses, the reader or the hearer gets moved along one thread of possible meaning, and then maybe has to jump to the other if he or she thinks maybe that wasn't what Karen was trying to say. But Ash and a number of these poems have at least 3 registers running at the same time. So ash is a kind of tree. You've just heard that it's used at least in 3 of the tribes for making their houses. Ash also means, for me, it's symbolic as an ex-Catholic of Ash Wednesday and sinning. I was also just in Berlin, and ash also, for me, symbolizes the ash of the burned bodies of the European Jewry. And it also means fire. It's what's left after the fire, which is necessary to eat and to live, which requires wood. So there's a bunch of circles that move in different directions, even just by focusing on the word ash. And I think I'll read a poem after this word, and that's going to happen with the word ash. Okay, ash. 4 from grape leaves, 1 from a cutting, 1 at large in the ship's hold. A finite collection of comings and goings. Everything counts, everything's armed. Fever in the upper regions. S-shaped punctures still developing. Immune systems. In Ontario, outbreaks traced to 10. Belgium, Germany, Israel, France, Finland, India, Italy, Jordan, Mexico, Russia. In crating and suspicious dunnage. 37 pallets native to Asia, northeastern China, Korea, Mongolia, Japan, Russia, Taiwan. So hold that in your head. It's a story of hypothesis about where the beetle that's destroyed the ash came from. But I also read it as a sort of worry about immigration patterns too. So you can read it in a couple of levels. So I will read you now. There's one called globe thistle. And we just heard a little bit about the globe thistle. Shall we read this one? This one's short. Dave just told us about the goldfinches loving the globe thistle. And this one is called globe thistle, which is considered an invasive species.
Yeah.
Okay, so it's,
right. It is.
it's characterization. And on Thursday, you'll see pictures of me pulling out thistle on the farm market. But from de côté des oiseaux, it's something else. Okay, globe thistle. 6 in soil with primroses and moss. Another 6 in debris under a dead hawk. Under patio stones. In fresh, hot horse dung. Can potentially adapt to contrasting soil environments. Is a dominant species in most old field communities. A sexual stage is required. A silver, hairy stem. A pulsing of false positives. Whether each species was resident or not to make a distinction between which live permanently in the region or those that overwintered and those that might migrate through the area and do not overwinter here, see table 2. The ideal outcome being we won't have to. So these are. So I have a method about science, but I'll leave that. There's actually in a book that Nathalie Blanc just published that's called Life, Art Forms, and Science. There's a piece that I wrote about the process by which I basically stole from science and talked to scientists and got them to show me the world that I was trying to inhabit. I have one more. This is where my eyes are, the glasses are going like this. So maybe I'll just try like this. It's really wild. Okay. This is a short poem. This will probably, you'll let me know if I have time for one more, but this can be the last one too. And so, one of the things that's fascinating to me, and as Pascale said, I used to be a scientist and I did field work and I did lab work. And I'm really interested by the feeling of what it is to be so curious and devoted to the natural world that one goes out in the rain for 10 years to take samples from a stream. This is not something I have to do as a philosopher. On the other hand, and maybe not even on the other hand, but in the same hand, a kind of hubris and optimism about being able to figure out how things work so that we could actually mitigate damage or fix damage. So this slight like hubris that's always attached to these strategies in science. And right now in North America, we have a giant problem in the ditches with the invasion of a kind of grass that's called Phragmites. And I've actually seen it in France. When I left Perpignan last time and I went up to Paris, I saw it everywhere. I thought, shit, it's everywhere. And in Canada, what it's doing is, among other things, it's displacing the kinds of the cattails that were, I mean, if you've ever read anything about the history of the peoples, the first peoples, the uses that they made of cattails were like astronomical for knitting and cordage and eating and not to mention that they're food for birds and insects. So at this point, this species called Phragmites is displacing the cattails. And I was thinking as I was coming here, it's not to say that it's a bad or a good thing, it's that there's a problem with the rate of change. Because over 10,000 years, the first peoples, the Winnebago, the Potawatomi, the Algonquin, the Iroquois, the Chippewa, they figured out what to do with these plants. And the Phragmites are coming in at like so fast, in 2 years, entire spaces are finished. So if we had 10,000 years, maybe we could figure out how to knit with them, how to eat with them, what kind of lizards would like them, but it's happening at a rate that's of concern. So the concern for me is always the rate. And this poem is called Controlled Burn, Phragmites. And a controlled burn is, as some of you know, it's ironic, the name, a controlled burn, because there's nothing controllable about fire. And one of the strategies that one of the scientists in this area where I was living, in the little black box, he was trying to restore what's called tallgrass prairie. And tallgrass prairie, prior to European contact and the bringing in of all these other kinds of plants that took up the space, and converted grasslands basically either to sand or forest, really diminished the biodiversity of these areas. And my friend Andrew, who's a grassland ecologist and works on this space, he wants to eliminate or kill off the Phragmites so that the natural grasses can come back into the space. And the tactic is a controlled burn. It's going to try to burn the hell out of them. But the roots go down something like 90 meters, right? And they don't know how to get rid of them. Do you cut them here? Do you leave them alone? What do you do? So the only thing besides the controlled burn, you can look at it on YouTube too. There's Andrew trying to deal with a controlled burn that actually, not surprisingly, gets out of control. And that I got to watch, right? He said, do you want to come and watch the controlled burn? I said, yes. The only thing else I want you to know from this poem is there's 3 names here that are the names of some of the original, what are called native grasslands. One is called Turkeyfoot, one is called Little Blue Stem, and one is called Indian grass. And even that tells you that the names weren't the names that the Hurons or the Neutral or the Winnebago would have used. These are European names. But Turkeyfoot, Little Blue Stem, and Indian grass. Controlled burn. Phragmites. A bobby pin. Fire tearing sideways through the raspberries. A bobcat in the rounded moss humps. Feline charcoal. Is an invasive plant causing damage to Ontario's biodiversity, wetlands, and beaches. Flannel flames gust. A heat that climbs its own shoulders to jump. Is rooting to extreme lengths, allowing it to survive in relatively dry areas. John Owen Lynch's eldest girl had another girl inside her, skeletonized. Is a perennial grass that has been damaging Ontario ecosystems for decades. Every hydro pool along the Blair Road, a perfect arrow of yellow, an outward rolling rim of scorch. Is not clear how it was transported to North America from its native home in Eurasia. Boiled tongues are licking the residential hydrogrid, the flammable golf course surface. Is an aggressive plant that spreads quickly and outcompetes native species for water, for nutrients. At the Grand River, the controlled burn dives straight down into the shale. A half-life of 5,568 years clocks to ash at 14 minutes and 8 seconds. Is releasing toxins from its roots into the soil to hinder the growth of and kill surrounding plants. The hands on Andrew's stopwatch melt at Turkeyfoot, Little Blue Stem, Indian grass, and the big ash is coming down.
Thank you so much, both of you.
Anything, including the goldfinch, that would be feeding and surviving off of this as well. I suppose almost all my poems, it begins with me, and I try to let go of that so that it can get a larger context than just myself. I don't really like writing about myself so much.
It's an interesting kind of adversarial thing too. If you picture this goldfinch throwing seeds, and it becomes kind of the arrows that's being kind of malicious towards you.
Yes. Yeah, and I'm trying to, every once in a while I will, this idea of the limits of human language, insert in a poem, slings and arrows, something from Shakespeare, that gives it a different layer or register, as we're talking about in a poem, which I enjoy also. So it can be both myself speaking or speaking for a larger portion of humanity, or another voice creeping in like Shakespeare's outrageous fortune. And it makes me think a little bit of the poem Sovereign about the house wren, because I teach, so I know what a lectern is. The house wren has no idea what a lectern is. So the biggest lectern in the land is my giving a little bit of something I know to this bird to try to understand it. And I hope I'm trying to be conscious that I'm not making the bird into a little professor or something. to give a piece of myself to the bird, if that kind of makes sense, and it helps me understand the creature, maybe.
Thank you both for really, really powerful word comment and question for both of you at the same time, being that you were able to so powerfully grasp. You both were very specific. I live in the Northeast, and you were very, very specific about that particular area, and that certainly comes through. And I just got the sense that it's very local, and yet to me it resonates so much within North American sort of eco-critical writing, and that whole constant emphasis on birds and the significance of birds in North American culture, going from Audubon to Rachel Carson, bald eagle versus turkey, etc., as national birds, having state birds. I guess my question would be whether, in your experience, familiarized with poets from other countries or from other regions, I think there's something very specifically North American. I can't describe it, but I get the sense of how you relate to what you're writing about in a local manner. And I'm wondering if, in your experience as poets, have you encountered that same sentiment from other poets from all of you might have met around the world, which you think I can't describe. You tell me about your own way to relate to the land, but it certainly sounds very North American to me. So I'm asking if you find that, I don't know, what poets you might have met around the world who relate to the land in such way, or do you find that they write about the land in a different type of connection that might make it specifically French or Indian or Spanish or whatnot? I'm sorry if it's a sort of all over the place question.
I hope you get a chance to read the whole thing, because I think I also undo my sense of clarity about where I am. Because there's such a tension between saying, this is where I'm from, which in a sense is true up through let's say my mother's side of the family to a certain extent. But through my father's side of the family, it's not where he's from. And so there's like the tension between knowing where you are and understanding where you are, trying to inhabit where you are in some kind of authentic, careful, modest, but real way, and still be not provincial and not closed and not closed to immigrants and not averse to things that change and evolve. So both of those, in this work, both of those strong sensibilities of trying and also, you pay attention, let's say, to the Nordic histories, which are not about staying in place. Like, I wonder if those two possibilities of both being where you are and fully being where you are and not being from anywhere but being a bunch of verbs that are happening would be possible no matter where one found oneself. I don't know. Maybe I turn it back to you.
I maybe I'll do a very personal response to it. I find I respond more to poets who seem grounded in place, in particular language. Like your poems, I think I'm sensing that with what you read. And we had a discussion earlier with a couple of people about, who didn't respond to John Ashbery. Great poet, but I don't have a connection, and I wonder if it's because I don't get in place with a poet like that. And I've not met Emily Dickinson, so I can't, but I love her poetry because of those birds that live in her backyard. And, and she knows them intimately, and also all the plants and the flowers in that space. So I'm not sure if it is a personal thing or if there's something else going on. But again, if it's a poet from Iceland or a poet I do a lot of work on Welsh poets. There's a poet named R.S. Thomas who's totally grounded in his place in Wales, and he writes about that, and he writes about the geography and the history, and I find it reaches me.
I'm going to add one tiny PS though. So this is, with full respect, I also respond to what you call place-based poetry. Probably more, although I'm not in on John Ashby. It's from a political person. So this is what's interesting to me about this moment in eco-poetry and eco-criticism, is if you're, of the side of birds and thistles, and you don't have your ear up against the wall of current, like, neo-colonial discourse, one can, and I'm just as easily guilty of this, sliding into a kind of either romanticism or even a sort of unconscious way of claiming authority for a space because of one's knowing of that space. And there's a large alarm bell that's rung in a political register by people who claim to know a place or to be of a place. And in the history even of Nazi Germany, there are roots that come from ecology that says, we are of this place. The German roots and the German blood, the Aryan blood is of this place. We know the birds. We know these rivers. Our blood is in these rivers. And everything else is kind of like a rat that's trying to get in here. So politically, it's complicated to know a place and to claim and want to claim anchorage and to have been affected by a place and to speak to that without putting your flag in the ground, even unconsciously, in a way that then just repeats these old gestures of fascistic exclusion of newcomers, or the flow that wants to flow, is difficult. So I'm not saying I can solve it, I'm just saying when one's aware of that, it's really hard to position one's idiom as an ecological poet or as a nature writer. That's all. And it's terrifying too, actually.
If you don't mind impeding upon the pause, because I felt really comfortable letting things go. So if you don't mind remaining and missing tea or coffee, we can go on for a few minutes, which would be lovely.
Sorry, I didn't look at the time. If you don't,
So
feel
let's
free
go
to.
on. Let's go on, but we're aware that we're going on.
I have questions for both of you. I hope it won't be take too much of your time. But just quickly to comment on, it's really interesting what you were just saying about Ecopoet, the kind of where to place oneself in ecopoetics. And I think it seems to me that there is really space for both of those. For me personally, it doesn't seem to. I agree with what this dilemma. It doesn't seem to me though that they can coexist. It doesn't seem like there's two kind of thistle sparrow poetry that is really place-based can coexist with really political and politically commentating on politics and neoliberalism and all those things at the same time. And I think they're both like the work that Robert McFarlane does, for example, with taking words, putting words back into the vocabulary of people, of for streams and hills and things, that is really important as well, and that can also be political in a way. And I just wanted to, that goes to a question that I was going to ask you, David, and then I have a question for you, Karen. That idea that was already brought up about sort of not speaking about the self in your poems so much. And it seems like there's a kind of decentering there, almost like Arthur C. and Jane Hirschfeld talk about this idea of like seeing the world as a web, sort of, and that eco-poetry tends to be a good place to not talk about the self, or those kind of go hand in hand. Do you find that is just something that is natural when you're observing nature, or you feel like you want to talk more about nature and maybe the self comes only in filters, or how do you see that?
Yeah, well, I think that there is a sense in which the self you. It doesn't mean that's the only way to do it, but I think for me, just because of who I am, that feels right. It feels good as a writer to be putting my focus outward. And as you say, I like this image you have of, I hadn't heard that before, Jane Hirschfeld, of decentering and creating a more web-like experience and sets of connections. It might also partly be an aesthetic thing too, in terms of the kinds of poetry that I like to read and listen to. I'm not sure. Yeah.
just another quick thing also about birds, because you've had quite a few poems about
Yes.
birds. Do you find that, are you interested, or do you ever think about the birds' rituals that are kind of almost similar? Do you think maybe humans were interested in birds because of these rituals that they have, like migration and mating rituals, for example? And do you think maybe
They're
there's
just
something in
such
that?
fascinating creatures. I just can't take my eyes off them. They're any creature that kind of comes within my scope. And so certainly their behaviors are kind of addictive to watch. If you heard one bird song in the morning, you want to hear it if you can get up, every morning or evening. So what is at the root of that? I honestly, I don't know what it is, but I think that is certainly a part of it, that are observing their patterns of behavior. And you learn more and more remarkable things about their navigation abilities and their sort of intricate mating abilities. I was watching a program about, what are they called? I think they're African birds with incredible plumage, and they dance these elaborate dances when they're mating. And really, it is absolutely birds of paradise. Yeah. So I don't know if I can write about a bird of paradise, but maybe one day I'll try. So yes, I'm sure that's a huge part of it. They're both very strange and very familiar, which I like as well.
I'm sorry, if I have time, just a quick question for you, Kim. You spoke about the forum briefly, and I wanted to know how you were reading the poems. Were they?
And they do different things, so you can rifle through this after if you want to
Yeah,
see. In some cases, so as I said, I took some science articles that had been published by data that was extracted from the kinds of birds and bees and wasps and trees and stuff that were there, and when they appear in italics.
Okay.
And sometimes I cite them and sometimes I don't cite them. And then in other poems, I set it up so that you move from one side of the page to the other like this.
Yeah.
So you can read it, and there are different histories depending upon whether you read it this way or this way. If you read it this way, you're going to get a nice little cozy history about pioneers. If you read it this way, you're going to get a sort of sad register of peoples who are genocidally gone. But if you read it back and forth, you get this odd dissonance.
In fact, does one inspire the other? Does the factual material get you writing?
Okay. I think we'll have to stop for now.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So much. Are your collections, Karen, and David, are your collections on sale downstairs? Did you bring some of your volumes?
I didn't. I have some, but I didn't put them downstairs. So
Could
could
you please do this? And Karen, did you bring some of your collections?
No, it didn't arrive to my house in time for when I left. But I'll send them and I can give the information to you. You can
Thanks so
order them
much.
online.
Yeah, please.
Why did you say that? That's not what the poems were about.